Hello and welcome to the Base Podcast. Today we are lucky enough to be joined by Clifton Duncan, who's a classically trained actor turned writer, currently based in Atlanta, Georgia. Clifton, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks a lot, guys. It's a pleasure to be with both of you.
Now, actually, Morgan first came across your work and you as a figure. So, Morgan, can you just tell us a little bit about how you came across Clifton's work?
Yeah. I think I saw Clifton. I saw you on a podcast years ago, and I thought you were sort of saying you were way ahead of the curve, in my opinion, and you were sort of giving voice to many of the thoughts that I had. And when me and Ollie started the base, you were one of the figures that I thought we must speak to Clifton and speak about his experiences in the dramatic arts. So that's why we're here, I suppose. Clifton, could you give us like a kind of rough kind of introduction to who you are and your story in life and how we sort of find ourselves here today?
Yeah, sure. Where do I begin? I mean, I was a shy army brat who split his formative years between Germany, Virginia, Belgium, and Virginia in that order. And I never had any designs on going into the arts specifically, although I was an illustrator, and I was inspired by comics like Calvin and Hobbes by Bill Watterson, if you're familiar with that, comic books as well. So I was going to be an illustrator. Then I followed some girl into drama class, which tends to be how straight guys end up doing theater. At least in this country. And I found that I had an aptitude for it. I got cast as Hugo in Bye Bye Birdie, that was my first play. And, suddenly this shy kid, my friends couldn't believe it. They just saw this person come to life that they'd never really seen before. And I never had any stage fright. I never once had stage fright. I just felt really comfortable at home on stage, but I was always kind of a class clown as well. And then, I did this play, and then it ended up being cheaper to go to study undergraduate theater in state, which was Virginia, than it was to go to the Savannah College of Art and Design, which is where I wanted to go study illustration. And I somehow bamboozled these people into letting me into their undergrad department, and I kept getting cast in shows. And my first year there, I was 17, and we did a play called The Day the Bronx Died, and it was this very serious play. And I discovered, like, wow, I'm not just the class clown. I actually have something to offer. And that was, it was at a time in my life, I think, where I needed to hear that kind of feedback. And, and we kept getting these guest directors, and they kept casting me in their shows, Romeo and Juliet and Jack Absolute and The Rivals. And, at a certain point, they stopped casting me in shows for the sake of equity. That was my first brush with equity, oddly enough, but in a sense, that is. Then I just found work in community theaters, the local professional theaters, and then I moved out to D.C., Washington, D.C., which is a great theater town. And that was the first time I was exposed to truly professional actors. And, guys who, you could see them, standing upstage and sort of whispering, but still being heard in the back of the theater, and watching these actors really embody these roles. There was one in particular named Greg, who I saw in one role do, it was some Oscar Wilde play in D.C., and, he was just sort of this dandy kind of very aristocratic character. And then a few months later, I saw Othello, and I saw this actor playing Cassio, who was so grounded, so gritty. He did this reputation speech, and I was just so blown away by this guy. And I opened up the program during intermission. There were 2 intermissions. And I shocked the people in the booth that were the stage management in the booth next to me, because I just audibly gasped. I couldn't believe that it was the same actor that I'd seen a few months before in this Oscar Wilde play. And I said, I'm okay at what I do, but I want to do what that guy does. He transformed himself completely, and he was so exciting to watch. And that idea, that concept of being a transformational actor really appealed to me. And what happens is you go to these regional theaters, right, and you open up the playbills, and inevitably you see amongst the younger actors, it's like, MFA from this place, BFA from that place, or whatever. Usually the most interesting actors I saw were from a school called NYU, New York University, or Juilliard. They're okay. And then there's Yale, but we don't talk about them, the Yale School of Trauma. But I put all my eggs into one basket, and I went to NYU graduate acting program up in New York at the Tisch School. And it's one of those programs, I think they audition like 1,000 people at that time, at least 1,000 people per year. And then they call back 50. Out of those 50, they offer spots to like 18 people. And I was able to kind of sail right through again for some reason. And that was, it was a rigorous 3-year program. And, I studied Greek texts and Shakespeare and Shaw and these other old plays and more contemporary plays. And I cried a lot. Then, I got released out into the world, into New York City. That's one of the reasons you go to one of these big schools, right? Is because you're there. And, I had an agent before I graduated, and I was meeting with these casting directors. And, over the span of just about almost 10 years, things really began to take off in 2017. But then eventually I found myself, sort of this shy kid who was working on stage with Tony Award-winning actors and being shared by Tony Award-winning directors and acting on television with people that I'd grown up, watching as a boy. And, I shook hands with people like Stephen Sondheim and was, it was just a really, really, I couldn't really believe it when it was happening, but it was a special thing. And then 2020 happened and everyone lost their freaking minds. And I felt compelled to begin to speak up, although I had sort of had my internal ideological shift some years before that. So I was sort of an outlier already. But
when did that ideological shift happen? And was there something you read or something you saw, something that happened that prompted that?
Well, there are a couple of gradual things or small things. Maybe they weren't so small, but it was one of those things, the analogy of if you're on a ship and you go 1 degree off or you're flying a plane or something, and just by 1 degree, and they take that 1 degree off in a certain direction over a period of years, you veer wildly into a different course. And so it was a couple of internal shifts, and then 2014 was a major shift. So the first shift was in 2007, and I was an intern, the equivalent of an intern at this theater festival called Williamstown up in the Berkshires, which is the northeast of the United States. And it's one of those big ritzy sort of gigs where, it's a short summertime gig. And so all the stars are coming in there, and it's a really fun place to be for a young actor. And there came a point, there's a story attached to it, but I won't get into it, but just to truncate it, I made this decision to say, you know what, I'm going to stop using my race as a crutch for everything that happens in my life. So that was the first shift. The second shift happened a couple of years after that, where I went through this really, really terrible breakup, and I had nothing, and I was broke, and I was just fresh out of grad school, and we were in the midst of a recession. I couldn't even buy a job, even at McDonald's, and I had McDonald's on my resume. I still couldn't get a job. And
you'd already worked at McDonald's, and you were trying to get another job at McDonald's.
Yeah, right. As a teenager, it was like my very first job, and I was down bad, so I was like, well, I'll see if I can get back into McDonald's. I guess I was overqualified for that job. But, so I'm working as a snack vendor at these Broadway shows, during intermissions, selling people candy and soda and things like that. And on a break during one of the shows, I went over to this bookstore called Borders, which used to be at Madison Square Garden. And I found this book called No More Mr. Nice Guy by a guy named Robert Glover. And it was the first sort of pro-masculine book that I'd ever read. And it really shifted my perspective, where page after page I'm turning, I'm saying, wait a minute, this describes so much of my experience. And so at that moment, I stopped apologizing for being male, which sort of had been I was kind of one of these guys who was like, anything men can do, women can do better. And there are better halves and everything. And so those two shifts, not leaning on my race as a crutch and not apologizing for being male, those were those sort of 1 degree shifts that over time led me on the path to really sharply having a sharp aversion to identity politics and sort of being collectivized according to your race or your sex. But the biggest shift was in 2014. And it's always hard to get into it because there was this massive online kerfuffle that came to be known as Gamergate. And I won't get into the specifics there, but because it's so convoluted. But essentially what I took away from that was I saw firsthand several key things. One was how people who call themselves liberals and progressives tend to operate and shut down discussion. They will group you by your race and ascribe a certain set of opinions to you that you're supposed to have. And if you don't have those opinions, then there's something wrong with you. And they're vicious, vicious people. And I also saw how the event was reported on. That episode infamously produced or was the inspiration for a Law and Order SVU episode about that incident, which was so bad that everyone hated it. But, I was getting into these arguments on Facebook back when I was on Facebook with people who were just confidently asserting that it was about, this particular thing, the typical, far right white males who hated having women in tech and everything, or gaming or whatever. And I was like, no, it's not that. Like, I happened to be in the right place at the right time to watch the entire drama unfold. So it was really, in a way, the sort of precursor to many of the, we use the term culture war, the culture wars that we sort of see now. And the year after that, of course, Donald Trump emerges and everyone loses their minds. He scrambles their brains. And then, it really took off after that. But by 2014, I'd had these shifts, and meanwhile, the industry itself was also beginning to shift sort of in the other direction.
Yes. It's just resonating with me. A lot of this is a similar, like we've all probably had similar moments, haven't we? Where you sort of something happens and then you turn around, they're going the other way.
Pretty much the same trajectory. I even remember the Gamergate. Well, and
Clifton, can I jump in with my story for what it's worth? Because I think it's kind of interesting, these kind of moments that people have had over the last 10 years. I remember I think I saw Douglas Murray once on a Guardian panel, and I remember him being presented as this, they sort of brought him on as this awful, evil guy. And he was making lots of points that I was like, I think he's right. He's saying things that I couldn't help but think he agree with him. And I told a leftist I was friends with, a fellow leftist, that I thought, he's quite interesting, this guy. And he sort of shot me down and told me, you can't say that. And I said, well, no, but I'm not saying he's amazing. I'm just saying he did make some good points, and you weren't doing. So that was a little tremor for me. It was lots of tremors actually, but that was one of them. But then my kind of big cultural moment was the Covington school thing? Do you remember this?
Yes, yeah.
That was probably a few years after Gamergate. It was 2017 maybe, and I'd seen the kind of way that's the MAGA guy with the MAGA cap on, the white guy, and he was standing there. They put him, "This is the face of white supremacy." They kind of had it as almost a headline and all the kind of.
Well, he wasn't even a guy. He was a kid. He was a 16-year-old kid.
Yeah. And he was a 16-year-old kid. And anyways, and I looked into that, and I remember seeing, if you watch the full video of that story, I don't know if have you seen it, Clifton? I presume you have.
Where the guy came over and started banging a drum in his face, and it was completely reported on, in the inverse of what actually happened.
Yeah, so this guy's walking through with a MAGA cap on, which is probably a big enough crime for some people anyway. But he's walking through, and he's goaded by these kind of sort of quite extreme black nationalists to start with, and then these kind of.
I got to correct you. So these are the Black Hebrew Israelites, and if you've been in DC at all, they're out there all the time. These guys are extreme. So that's the context. Yeah.
So they kind of were shouting at him, screaming at him, and he kind of was very dignified actually for a long time. He didn't respond to any of them. And then these, I don't know what the right term is, like Native Americans. What's the word that I should say now?
Native American is fine.
I'll be okay with that one. Okay. Native Americans, they started screaming at him too. And he's kind of walking through, and he's not actually doing anything apart from wearing this cap. And eventually, after like half an hour of being goaded, he turns around and all he does is just stand and look at them. And that was the shot. And I remember, and when I saw that, I remember going, this is not right. That story's not correct. I've seen it. And then I would tell people that, and they just wouldn't hear it.
Yeah, I mean, even I remember at that time, I mentioned to somebody, I was working on rehearsing some play, and I mentioned that incident to one of my castmates. And this was highly intelligent, highly educated woman whom I had, and in many ways still have a lot of respect for. But, her knee-jerk reaction to it was just, she just got her hackles up immediately. And you sort of run into, when you have these conversations, the kind of, I don't want to say programming because it sounds sort of, conspiracy-ish, but, they're literally called programs. So, I mean, I don't know why you should shy away from the word, but, it runs so deep, and, and I'm sure we'll get into this later, but there are so many, the way the business is set up, there's so many incentives to never rock the boat and to always sort of fall in line ideologically and politically with people. So, so you put yourself in dangerous waters trying to explain, well, no, actually what happened is that guy came over to him and began beating the drum in his face. And, it was a very crazy scene. And, so I remember sort of being like, you don't have to like who we voted for, but this is what actually happened. And, those kinds of things, they just don't really sink in for these kinds of people, which is very, and it becomes very, I'm sure, as you know, very alienating after a while, because, who among your peers and your colleagues can you really talk to about these kinds of things, about the things that really matter to you?
So I mean, it's difficult, isn't it? It felt really lonely at times, actually, when you were kind of starting to sort of notice some of these things. So you sort of did the worst two things at the worst possible time. You said, I'm not going to make race a big thing for me, and I'm going to be unapologetically masculine. And you're sort of they're sort of wrong. They're kind of noble choices, but at the wrong time in history, because those two things became like the opposite, didn't they? It was suddenly like masculinity was kind of, that was the worst thing you could do, and the most important thing during the kind of the explosion of identity politics over the last about 10 years ago was to kind of acclaim your identity group and in some cases weaponize it. I think probably would be a fair thing to say. Not all the time, but I think some people would have done that.
Well, no, there's a very strange and perverse incentive structure, and I always feel the need to apologize to my friends across the pond. Every time us Yanks flush something down the cultural toilet, it just bubbles up overseas for some reason, and so a lot of the race stuff. I mean, it's just, there's a very perverse incentive structure in this country where if you're a Black person who says, you know what, I'm an individualist and I like to think independently. I think that I'm not going to blame whites, either living or dead, for the problems in my life. I think I have agency. I think that, I don't want to be just handed things because of my race. I think it's condescending. You get shunned and shamed and a sort of lower caste system in a sense. But at the same time, if you're someone who says, I'm a victim and you all owe me something, and this country is irredeemably racist and everyone evil, and I'm going, nothing will ever be enough, and I am, and I don't want equality. What I want is supremacy, to be honest with you. Then you're rewarded. You get Pulitzer Prizes, you get MacArthur Genius Grants, you get to be a famous actor, you get all kinds of rewards, and you're lavished with praise by the intelligentsia, by your friends and colleagues. You sort of get heralded as this sort of leader. But if you're a Black person who says, no, I'm not really about that, you face a lot of condemnation, and it's very, very strange and very bizarre.
Yeah. And particularly in the arts, in the dramatic arts, you would have been encouraged to take on a certain type of racial politics, because so I follow this quite closely from over here. I'd follow so there's Ta-Nehisi Coates and Ibrahim X. Kendi, who are sort of more on the kind of the woke side of Black politics, I suppose, and it's a complicated, broad word. But then you had like Glenn Lowry and John McWhorter, Shelby Steele. There's a few. I got really into it at one point, and you'd follow all of these. But I suppose in our field, McWhorter and Lowry were probably seen as like lunatics, weren't they? They were seen, you couldn't really go along with those types of people. They had a more complex and nuanced, and they differ actually. I used to listen to them all the time, debate, and they actually do have quite different views on it. But
well, that's the strange thing about it, is because Glenn and John, John is a liberal and Glenn is more conservative. But even still, John gets guff because he's not quite liberal enough, and he's someone who teaches at an Ivy League institution, the Columbia University in New York City. And so I can see him, I was on Glenn's show recently, and I could see John tiptoeing around certain issues and not wanting to weigh in. And I know the reason is that, there's a term I heard called reputationally paranoid. He still wants to be invited to all the nice parties. He doesn't want to be, I'm psychologizing, and speculating, but, I presume that he doesn't want to be disinvited from certain elite groups and circles and, the kind of people that he hangs out with. But there are still people who don't want to differentiate. I think we joked about this when we first sort of met, when I was on the show with him, that they don't really want to distinguish between someone like him and someone like Candace Owens. You're only supposed to be this one thing. And the fact that Ibram Kendi, aka Henry Rogers, it's so difficult for me to call him by his preferred name, because I think very little of him. But the fact that his ideas, his philosophy, and his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. I couldn't get through 2 chapters of this book, gentlemen, because and not because it was difficult to read, but I was just laughing so hysterically at about every third sentence, because it was just so obviously not up to par. Then you read someone like a Thomas Sowell and read his kind of work, and read you see how he lays out his arguments. You see the systematized method of his systematic thinking, his rigorous sort of logic, his data-rich argumentation, and it's very complex thinking and how he lays out his concepts. And then you read someone like Ibram X. Kendi, who cannot even define what racism is. And it's not an exaggeration. Someone asked him, and it's on camera, you can go find it. They asked him, how are you defining racism? And he said something like, it's a policy that creates, disparate, it was a circular definition. It made no sense. Like, you can't even define this word that you've based your entire career on. But, it's one of those things where if you're someone like that, you can be a complete intellectual mediocrity. You can have nothing original to say, nothing of value to offer that hasn't been said for the past 60 years at least in this country. And you'll be lavished with praise by liberals. And in a way, that's why I say that the far left and the far right are equally racist. It's just that the far right, at least, is somewhat commendable because they're overt and they're honest. And they'll tell you straight up, that they prefer, a white ethno-state, or they think that, you're intellectually inferior because of your race and that it's a genetic sort of a thing. And, they'll be straight up about it. But the progressives and liberals, people who call themselves that, will be completely condescending to you, but they're doing it on your behalf, And so for myself, I find myself sort of like, well, where do I stand? Because on one hand, on one side, there's people who are saying around blacks never relax. On the other side, there are people who are calling me out because I don't go along with the sort of liberationist, sort of what Sol calls the civil rights vision. It's just it's kind of a lonely thing to be.
I just want to drill down into your perspective on the psychology behind some of this, because I remember in 2020, and we'll kind of get to specifically what happened with you in 2020, but I remember I was rereading that wonderful Thomas Wolfe essay, I'm sure you know it, of the Black Panthers at the Bernstein's party, the radical chic. You come across this essay?
No, I don't know this.
Oh, it's like from the 60s, maybe even 70s. Thomas Wolfe, the kind of conservative novelist, bonfire of the vanities. And he writes this brilliant essay called, well, he sort of coined the term radical chic. And it's all about how, the Bernsteins, these like the upper echelons of New York, liberal intelligentsia, invited the Black Panther to the Black Panthers to their dinner parties, basically. And Tom Wolfe is watching this and just kind of finding it quite absurd. And I remember reading it and finding very strong echoes in 2020. But what is behind the psychology of the white liberal kind of fetishization of this radical chic? Like, why does it gain such traction? Do you have any theories on that?
Well, I think, to sort of steelman it, I do think it comes out of a genuine sense of guilt. I've been seeing a lot of commentary amongst sort of online right-wing figures about the sort of collapse of this sort of baby boomer post-war ideology where the worst thing you can be is Hitler. I think in the United States, there is that, but also the worst thing, the word racist is the N-word for white people, basically. So you can't, it's the worst thing that you could be. And, we have a history, a very shameful treatment of Black Americans. And I think, since the 1960s, there's been this idea where we have to do everything that we can in order to right the wrongs of the past. So I think that so much of our social discourse, so much of our education system, so much of, public propaganda, you could say a lot of our cultural institutions have sort of imbibed this idea of where we have to save the Blacks. We have to right what's wrong. And so I think there's a part of it which is genuine. But, it's interesting because I was at Hoover Institution actually very recently and speaking with some powerful Black conservative figures out there. And sort of this recurring theme was that a lot of these people, they'll talk left, but they live right. And what they mean is that they'll spout all the slogans and say all the right things, but in their personal lives, the personal choices that they make, you sort of see they sort of give up the ghost. And they don't necessarily live around Black people, or they talk to them in a condescending way, that they presume that they're kind of stupid and don't get it. It's really they become very paternalistic and infantilizing. But I think I split between a genuine, if I'm to speculate, I split between this desire to really, they genuinely and it's very sincere, I think, in earnest. They say, well, people were treated very badly, and you also have to understand that they grow up because of the sort of 1960s civil rights vision, and what's taken as axiomatic in the sort of left-wing identity politics and racial politics and social politics is this idea that Blacks continue to live under a pervasive system of aggressive, systematic oppression and racism. And so they really do think, I mean, it's sort of a religious belief in a way where nothing can dispel it. And so, but they feel like they have to do everything they can to help people who look like me, even when people like me are saying, no, you know what, I'm good actually. So I think some of it is genuine. I do think some of it is also performative, and it's done for social points and for career's sake. Because, what I found oftentimes is when you get these people kind of one-on-one and they figure out that you're safe. And it's funny because when I say that, there's a lot of Black leftists who deride the idea of a Black person being safe, meaning being palatable to white people. You get along with white people? There's something wrong with you. I mean, that's literally what they think. But, once their guards are down, they sort of know the score. I feel this sense of palpable relief amongst them where they say, okay, I don't have to walk on eggshells. I can actually say what I really think. It's not that I'm racist. It's just, I notice certain things and, and I'm told to say or think a certain way and I'm told to shut up. But, so again, it's hard to tell how much of it is performative and how much of it is genuine. I certainly think I'm going to get myself into even more trouble, but at this point, who cares? Certainly amongst the women, it's very. I think it's a very, very deeply held belief. And you mentioned Morgan earlier the term weaponized, and I think in many, many ways the empathy of women has been weaponized in a major way and put forth many of these things. But that's sort of outside the scope of this particular podcast. But it's just, I think it's.
Are you saying that there's like a feminine tendency towards empathy, which means these kind of this psychology is exaggerated? And
no, I would never suggest that men and women might express themselves differently and might have different ways of processing emotion. I would never ever suggest that. But but what I will say, there's that whole kerfuffle recently about the quote unquote great feminization.
Yeah.
And
yes, this is what I was thinking of. Yeah.
Well, I think especially, I'm sure you've experienced this as well, especially in the arts. It is very, very, very noticeable and notorious even. And I do think that, in a sort of more feminized industry like the theater or the entertainment industry as a whole, that is a very, and again, we're already, we're actors and we're performers, we're already more sensitive and emotional and vulnerable than the standard population. So you get that together, and probably people with some personality disorders and some emotional issues and trauma, it becomes a mess. Certainly that aspect of it as well. That I think that aspect can't be overlooked, honestly, if we're speaking frankly.
Yeah, I think we should speak frankly. I think yeah, we're into like really dangerous cancelable territory here. But like, let's be free and let's think, because these are great subjects, aren't they? Really, and all of this stuff is ripe for exploration, and that's what the artists should do is go into this stuff. I think that you can feel that. I would say that the feminized. I'd like to talk to Helen. Is it Helen Andrews who wrote the article about this?
Yeah.
I'd like to talk to her actually about this further, because I will say on film and TV sets now, there's more feminine energy. The whole thing, there's a lack of masculinity anywhere right now. Some of that, I think, is actually, some of it is quite nice. I think there is probably more a sense of, there's a care. People are like, even though people are quite terrified, there's sort of, some of this stuff was like some men were acting really badly. And I've seen that. I've seen like famous directors be horrible on set. It's not because they're a man necessarily, but I have seen it. But there is this kind of, so there's weird things happen where there's this sort of like kind of niceness to everything, but there's no like, I'm quite a manly man. I'm not some sort of whatever super chad, whatever they call, but like, I like men. I've spent my life around men. I'm used to like masculine energy, and I can feel it. Like when I go, oh, this is like, there's no drive here. There's no danger. There's no sense of adventure. So I think I think this is happening like in the arts. I think the feminization, I'm going to get myself cancelled if anyone is listening. I don't know if they are. There is a general feminization, I think, with all of this. And friends of mine who are women have said the same thing to me. They said they're desperate for men. They get in a room with men in the arts. So like, thank God, like, where have you been for the last 10 years?
And it's interesting too, because I've noticed in older women, specifically, I'm thinking of two that I know. One was a very famous actress on a popular TV series. Another is highly accomplished, another actress, TV and producer who was a mentor of mine for a while. And, both of them were just like, God, everyone's so fucking polite. Like that, like that was sort of their attitude. about it. And so, and I mean, I've worked with women like Susan Stroman, for instance, who's a 5-time Tony Award winner, brilliant choreographer and director. And she has I mean, she's demanding. She's a demanding director. And, it's a very sort of, I won't call it a masculine kind of energy, but she doesn't F around, and it's a pleasure to work with. I'll give you a prime example of like the difference in energy. I was doing 2 musical workshops back to back, and one, I think, was the world premiere of The Notebook, which they turned it into a musical. And then the next one was this very weird kind of avant-garde musical. I forgot what the book it was based on. And in The Notebook, as a director, I think it was Michael Greif. And it was funny because we're on the train. We're doing the show in Poughkeepsie. We're on the train ride, the van. We're in the van on the way from the train to the facilities. And I remember him in the back seat saying, people think I'm bossy. I can be pretty bossy. And, 10 a.m., day one, the minute that the clock struck 10, he was just, okay, we're doing this, we're doing that, we're doing that. We have new pages, we go this, go back, da-da-da-da-da. If you messed up, he was like, what are you doing? Get back over there. And I saw all these people kind of shrinking in horror and terror. And, but if you were doing your work and you were on point, he didn't mess with you. But for me, I was like, this is fantastic. Yes, This is the best thing ever. I mean, he ran it. I mean, he was a general, and I loved it. The week after that, it's a lovely director whom I won't name, but I do love her to death. Very smart, very warm, but it was a very weird piece. But she was just like, okay, so like, what does everyone think? Or someone asked a question of like, hey, what does this line mean? I don't really understand. It's like, it's very interesting. I don't know. What do you all think about that? Da-da-da. And it's like, dude, we don't need, I mean, the energy was so different. And, you pick up on, okay, well, I can't say this a certain way, the way that I would say it because someone might get offended. And, I think the scene might be missing something or yada, yada, yada. But, you're right, Morgan. At the same time, when I don't know how bad it got over in the UK, but I shouldn't use the word bad. Maybe intense is a better word. But, we had what was called the sort of Me Too era, the hashtag Me Too. And, I had the exact same experience where I'd be in rehearsals and watching, some older director corralling some young starlet. And, she's so beautiful. Isn't she so beautiful? And I remember in this one workshop looking around, at this small group of people, these actors, and one woman in particular, who I love to death and respected her so much, man. Just a hardworking actress. And she was smiling and nodding, but it was such a strained she had so many dimples in her chin from just sort of holding back whatever she really thought. And it clicked for me to say like, oh, wait a minute. I wonder how many weird, sort of inappropriate comments, especially as actors, right? I mean, we're attractive, charismatic, sexy people. We're and that sort of our milieu, that's where we work. And, my attitude has always been that we need to be respectful and courteous and professional. But at the same time, there can be some weird dynamics there. And there are people that sometimes take advantage of that. And so I was and I was asking my friends, like, can you tell me about what you've experienced and yada, yada, yada. And there was one woman who was very honest with me, who she said, the sort of standard, like, well, men need to behave themselves. Like, okay, but she said, but also, there's a lot of women who are very attracted to powerful and charismatic men. And, she basically said, it's not harassment if he's hot. That was sort of her viewpoint on that. And, I appreciated that. But then I'd go on social media and it was like, men need to shut up. And for me, I had my ass slapped or groped 4 different times by 3 different women, 2 of whom were married, just in the past like few months leading up to that. So I'm like, so for me, I was like, I'm happy to have this conversation, but you're telling me as a man that I just have no say in this and I just have to shut up and listen. And so it's that kind of atmosphere where your mere existence and you having an opinion can be considered sexist. And I think people who aren't in the industry don't understand is that, if any suspicion is raised about, and I think women like Helen and others have brought this up, the sort of aggression that takes place is what we call cancel culture, where you're excommunicated and, your reputation is ruined. And it's an industry built on reputation and relationships. And, if you get stained, I mean, I've got friends who, you get phone calls and it's like, who is this person? They said something about this. I have a friend who is musical theater royalty and, Tony Award winning artist. And this guy made the mistake of making a mild defense about a conservative Supreme Court justice And, and he's found himself losing jobs over it. This is a man who has proven his mettle and his artistic worth, and it's damaged his career. I mean, they recently, for the Tony Awards, they came after Patti LuPone. Patti LuPone is woke as woke can be, but she made the mistake of having some mild criticism about a black female performer, and it became this huge thing where they had hundreds of Broadway actors signing a petition trying to get her banned from attending the Tony Awards. So no one is really safe in this thing. But the point is, it's the relational aggression, it's the gossip, it's the character assassination. And so these are kind of features that are common to people who observe how more left-leaning people tend to operate in terms of how they undermine people and destroy people. But I think when you have an atmosphere like show business or the arts in general, where it's a very heavily feminist kind of philosophical space, and again, sort of similar to the racial aspect, they want to right the wrongs of the past. You have to take a back seat. Otherwise you're mansplaining, or you're man-interrupting or whatever. But when you're in these environments, it just, you have to walk on eggshells because, last story I'll share with you about this.
By the way, did you say man-interrupting?
Yeah, man-interrupting was a thing for a little bit. I was doing a workshop with this new play, and the director was this, brilliant director, the Tony Award-winning director, and the actress as well, who's also writing the play. And from the beginning, these two women were very sort of dismissive. They were cold. They were condescending. And, I couldn't understand why, but it was very palpable. Come to find out, a couple of weeks later, I'm talking to the actress / writer of the playwright, at one of the get-togethers, late, some party or whatever. And she told me how both of these women had made up their minds that, I'm a strapping 6'3" lad who's as masculine as a musical theater actor can be, and whatever that means. But they had decided that I didn't, that I was uncomfortable having women in charge, that I couldn't take direction from a woman, and that everything that I said was rooted in this sort of toxic masculine place where, I'm like, dude, I'm just a fucking actor trying to figure out this new play and this part and like what it is and asking questions. But they'd already decided in their minds who I am because of my sex. And so I had to go back and explain, like, this is completely off base and what you're talking about. But to create that kind of atmosphere, and again, if you're a man, you don't really understand those kinds of social dynamics that are going on. It can be very, very disorienting and sort of, I'll say, oppressive sometimes. And so, again, like you were saying, Morgan, you have this atmosphere now where it's just very, what they'll say, female coded. And, there are certain things that you just can't say because it's sexist, or, you'll be called some kind of name out of this place of not necessarily vindictiveness or maliciousness, but this sense of like this weaponized empathy of, no, we can't say that. We have to be nice to everyone. We have to make sure that everyone is comfortable. And to quote the great Warren Beatty, I mean, look, if everyone's having a good time, it ain't going to be any good. And so, you need to have tension sometimes. You need to have people, kind of butting heads and maybe arguing, not aggressively, not, coming to blows and resorting to fisticuffs, but, some degree of tension, some degree of directness, some degree of bluntness, and saying like, no, this is bullshit. I don't buy this, and yada, yada, yada. But it's just very, very difficult in these spaces now.
Well, I think what people miss, that this is kind of how guys talk to each other if left to their own devices. But when it's like talk to like I can speak to a woman in the same way that I would speak to a man, and they would read it as aggressive or mansplaining. I'm like, no, this is how guys kind of communicate.
And I'll say this, I'll jump in again, is that, because there's an expectation on our part to conform to the way they communicate and understand the way they communicate. And we have to do it for our survival. But, they don't have the same level of, I don't know if desire or the same level of need to learn how and appreciate how we communicate. And, they could easily say, well, now you know what it's like to be us. So, maybe that's fair. But at the same time, it's like, I think it would be more progressive in my mind if we learn to understand that there's always going to be some tension between men and women, because we we're the same in many ways, but we're also very different in some key ways. And we have different communication styles. We hear and use language very differently. And so, I think having this sort of mutual understanding would be would allow us to be much more honest and open and more communicative with each other than the sort of current standard, which is like, well, if you're a man and you're breathing, then you're oppressing somebody somewhere. So just tuck your dick between your legs and shut down.
Yeah, just to quickly say something on this, and we can maybe move on to some other subjects, but I don't want to come across like I'm saying like that there should be no women directing us at all, because actually like the last few jobs I've booked have been with fantastic female directors, and many of the kind of most interesting artistic people I've worked with have been women.
Of course.
And so I think it's probably worth acknowledging as well that there was a lot of terrible men holding the guard in like Western culture. There was obviously lots of good men as well, but we did grow up in a culture, I know in Britain, of quite pathetic men all over the place, right? There were no leaders anywhere. There were no spiritual, cultural leaders. That's why Jordan Peterson was such a phenomenon when he came through, was because it was like this kind of, he was like a leader, sort of spiritual thought leader who came through and started to talk about morals and meaning. And he had this dramatic effect on men, because we grew up in an era of like, in this, you probably won't even know some of these names, Clifton, like Chris Evans, Chris Moyles. They were like counting down on radio to when Charlotte Church would turn 16 so she could lose her virginity. Just loads of like crappy men. So I kind of see that like of course they tried to take us out. You know what I mean? Then Me Too happened and it just felt like this whole war started. But yeah, it's
well, see, I think there's a lot of guys, like you and I and Oliver, who what I see is that I think men in general are, for a lot of reasons, I think this applies to life as well, is that we're willing to be, generally speaking, we're willing to be accommodating and willing to say, okay, cool, like I'll adjust, and I can be flexible, and I'm happy to work with you because, my agents and my managers were my mentors. A lot of them were women. My favorite teachers were women. And I enjoyed a lot of, like some great collaborations with brilliant women directors and actors. But I think the imbalance comes in where it's like, okay, I think we would have a healthier culture if we could just be able to meet each other halfway and understand that, again, it's tricky because in our business, lines can be very blurred in terms of the type of work that we do. But if it's an environment where she can say whatever she wants and express herself in whatever way she wants, I can't even I can't express myself, again, with a base level of professionalism, but I can't say a certain thing. I did one show where I was trying to make a point about, it was an acting, not adjustment, just idea where I said, well, this play set in the 1940s. So, it's World War II, and maybe the play that we were working on was called Carmen Jones, an adaptation of Bizet's Carmen. And I said, well, maybe, we're in a world where men and women aren't used to working together. And in terms of Prosper Mary May's original novella and the opera as well, there's this great combustible mix of sex and danger all the time. And so I said, well, maybe for the sake of our scene work and our ensemble work, we can sort of keep in mind that maybe these men and these women aren't used to occupying the same space together because, maybe for the first time, these women are in these workforce factory jobs or whatever. And I just got shut down immediately by saying, this woman was like, women have always been working. Da, 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 da. I'm like, that's not the fucking point that I'm making. What I'm saying is, as actors, we might find value and get some mileage out of, imagining some kind of tension and some kind of unease, some kind of electricity between these male and female workers. That's the point that I was making. But she took it as, making some point about, like, I guess women didn't belong in the workplace. And so it's these kinds of things where, it becomes a very sort of, I think a lot of men experience this in relationships. Like, am I going to say this because it's going to be a whole argument? And do I want to, maybe I'll let it go. It's just a very tricky environment to step through. And it's hard to talk about it.
Polite, right? But what you're describing there is not a polite interaction. It's not a good faith interpretation of what you're saying. And I'm actually like, I'm all for politeness. Do you know what I mean? I think politeness is great. I love kind of old academic debates where they're going like, well, of course, as my esteemed colleague is saying, I profoundly disagree with him, all this kind of stuff. I think there must be a space for that is robust, but is deferential, is polite, and what you're describing there is actually just, it's not that.
Well, because it's coming from a place, and this is the last thing I'll say about that. We can, talk about something else, but it's coming from a place where, like those two esteemed colleagues that described, the playwright and the playwright and the director, where, if you can't have a dialogue with people if they're coming in presuming that you're the enemy, and that's the kind of problem that I see, where I'm coming in saying like, hey man, I'm just happy to be here, and they're coming at it and saying like, you're evil, and your evil patriarchal blood needs to be taken down a peg, just by fact of you existing. We're going to deal with you a certain way. The kind of conversations you can have, the kind of opinions you can share, it kind of colors everything. Just to bring it full circle, it's just, I notice that there are older women, especially, who are very, very tired of this kind of thing and wish that, there was some more blunt, not necessarily masculinity per se, but just a more, a more directness, and not trying to sort of pussyfoot around everything and walk on eggshells. Just be like, let's be real with each other. So I think that's sort of the issue.
Yeah, I think I've got a skillful segue here. So one of the problems with this lack of acknowledgement of these kind of issues with gender or sex or whatever one of the big issues, I think, is that it actually destroys so many great plays and so many great scenes and characters in theatre history, right? If you go and look at like a Strindberg play, we did The Father last year. Have you read The Father by Strindberg, Clifton? It's a fantastic play, and it's the battle of the sexes. And Strindberg was furious at women at the time because his wife had an affair. She was an actress. She'd had an affair while on tour. And he writes this play in which a kind of woman is manipulating a man and turning him mad, right? It's a brilliant play. But she is a fantastic, fantastic female character. If I was she'd be one of the first parts I'd want to play. So even out of like difficult exploration and angry exploration comes these incredible kind of characters. And it's the same with Miss Julie as well, another one of his female characters. And if you look in The Seagull, with Arkadina and Constantine and Trigorin and those kind of tension, Nina, these tensions, she sort of wants to have sex with this older man, and then he knows that when you get rid of all these kind of these like opposites, the polars of the genders, right? It's genuinely hard to even like teach most of history, because only till like 30 years ago, most of the scenes, it's genuinely hard finding scenes, unfortunately, that aren't based upon some of these tensions. And so, yeah, it becomes like even hard. It becomes impossible to teach the canon and work on these great scenes, because you're scared to say in a class, we shouldn't be, but one can be, to say, right, this is, women can be like this and men can be like that. And when it's this happens, because all of a sudden everyone goes, whoa, what do you mean men can be like this or women could be like that? You think, oh, goodness me. Yeah, I find that really frustrating, and I'm sick of it. I'm just sick of it, because I just want to get on and explore this stuff. I'm not saying men, but let's do the scene. Romeo and Juliet, let's go into it. What's happening here? And so I think, therefore, one of the things me and Ollie are really interested in, I kind of want to, this is my segue, is like the study of the classics. And did you find that everything was becoming so politically, ideologically swerved that you weren't even allowed to kind of continue your love of the craft or your study of the craft?
Well, it's funny because you both catch me at a very interesting time. I've been very immersed in this book called The 7 Basic Plots. Have you heard of it? By Christopher Booker.
Yeah.
It's I love this book so much. It's not quite as mystical as as a Joseph Campbell, and not quite as schematic as Save the Cat or something like that. But but he really does a deep dive into 7 basic plots, but also the sort of pillars within those plots that they all have in common. But he takes you deeper and deeper as he goes through the book of what we're really getting at with these successful stories throughout history. And he goes through all these novels, plays, modern, classic. It's fantastic. It's a wonderful, exhilarating book to read. But what we're really talking about is archetypes and archetypal behavior, and a great sort of story that encapsulates this, what you're talking about, Morgan, is, there was a production of Othello here at a small theater in Virginia a few years ago, and they had a non-binary Othello, who was female, but, they identified as non-binary. And And right away I said, that destroys the play.
Yeah.
It's nothing against that particular actress, but but beyond the sense of, war and fraternity, sort of masculine drives that, underpin the play on a visceral level, it's a far different thing for me to be choking Desdemona to death in that last scene. Chris Booker would say, you're killing the anima, the innocent, pure female energy. It's one thing to see a big, swarthy man, who he told you at the beginning of the play, since 7 years pith, his arms have been used in battle and, the broils of battle. And, so he's a mighty, mighty, general, and he's a warrior. He's a soldier. That has a completely different kind of impact than watching some like 5'8", they, them, choking someone of equal size. You know what I mean? It's not a knock on that person's performance. It's just you destroy that dynamic of here is this big masculine figure, this dark masculine figure, in many ways of the many sensitive of the term, choking the light. I mean, put out the light and then put out the light, as he said. You feel that as an audience member. I remember watching the National Theater production with Rory Kinnear and Adrienne Lester, and I forgot who the woman was that did the violence on that, but it was so disturbing and so shocking. And I'm like, yes, that's what you want to see because it's supposed to be that. And it's just not the same thing if it's someone who identifies as this certain thing. And so I say all that to say that what we're really talking about, is we're dealing with archetypes and archetypal behavior and what we recognize. I mean, the Scottish play, I don't know if we're allowed to say, the actual word, but, that's what's so interesting.
We have to be very careful with that word because I thought I got cocky and I started to say it once in a class. And I thought and a door just opened behind me.
Oh, God.
And it was
Isn't it just that you're not allowed to use it in an actual theatre or a rehearsal room? I think
Ollie, it's spread now.
Never.
It's got
you
to
got to do the hot potato thing and turn around 3 times like in Blackadder.
Sorry, but yeah, go on.
Well, but even in that play, I mean, you guys know there's so much language about manly courage, and Lady M has that. I mean, her first scene in the play is "unsex me here," and I wish that I were a man. And I love the scene after he won't go through with the assassination attempt on King Duncan. And what happens in that scene? She manipulates him. She gets him right by the balls. What are you? Are you a man or are you not a man? Yeah. And every man understands what that is and what that pressure is, what that psychological and emotional pressure point is. And if you're coming from a place where you want to sort of break down the gender binaries and you have, maybe your Mackers is being played by a woman or they, them or whatever. Again, it's not a knock on that particular actor. And, maybe there is something that could be illuminated by gender swapping or whatever. But again, you miss that dynamic. And I think that an audience, even if they come there ready to enjoy it, on some level, they can't suspend their disbelief to that extent. And I think it dulls their enjoyment of the play because they know they're being told a lie, because it goes against their deepest kind of programming. Like they know what's true, even if they can't articulate what that is. And so I guess back to your original question, it's just if I'm being very honest, I think I hugely benefited from this sort of push for diversity. I found myself cast in a lot of great plays and a lot of great works that I wouldn't normally have been cast in. So I can't, it's tough for me to denigrate it completely. But what I will say is that when you are taking these works, and it could be like, they did a production of Oklahoma, the musical, a few years ago, and they kind of, modernize and deconstruct that as well. And it's like, no, you don't want your Curly, the romantic lead, to be this sort of wishy-washy, weak kind of guy. You want a strapping, charismatic, romantic leading guy, because then it makes sense that this girl is going to be into him, and so there's lots of interesting stories out there, and you can maybe illuminate some new things about certain characters or plays if you want to deconstruct them in some way. But I think one of the reasons that these classics work is because they're dealing in archetypal language, and we understand them implicitly because they're true to who we are as a species. I'm not averse to trying to find new colors in these works and trying to find new ways of looking at them. But I think the problem is that here's how I'll say it. There's this great essay by a writer named Isidore Snyder, who wrote back in the 1940s that, the classics work because they're true. And the irony of that is that if he said that today, he'd be called a far-right fascist, but he was a Marxist and a communist. He was writing for a communist publication back when he said that, and he was trying to write and warn his ideological brethren, like, guys, be careful of, doing all your work or seeing all of your work through this specific, Marxist lens, because it's going to make for weak, wasted schematic writing, and it's not going to last beyond the moment. And so I think that's what's happened, I think in a lot of these productions that we've seen, these sort of more woke productions where they're deconstructing everything, where it's like, okay, well, people aren't going to take this away, and remember this, because they're going to focus more on, oh, that was cool, Prospero being played by a woman. Okay, that's interesting. Maybe there's a devouring mother kind of story there, but and again, I mean, that's one of those plays where I think that actually could work, but it's like the gimmick becomes the thing and not the story or anything new about the story. And I think the classics are important just because, they were sort of my soft red pill in a way, because I read these plays that were like, hundreds and thousands of years old. And I was like, wait a minute, they're just like us. This is me. It's a window into how human nature has been unchanging for so long. And what motivates us has not changed, in so long. And, so you're getting a glimpse into who we are again as a species when you're reading these works. And on top of the skill and the wit and the wisdom and the depth of these works that you're experiencing. And I think if you have some kind of agenda where you're problematizing everything, or you're saying that, we have to dismiss this writer or this particular work because it doesn't quite align with my modern sensibilities. Well, I think you're just you're looking at it from the wrong lens, and in a way you're sort of lying to yourself and to the audience, and it doesn't help anyone. It doesn't push the art forward. It doesn't deepen our understanding of these works, and it's almost a violation in a way.